Hello, everyone. So since it's 12:04, I suppose we'll start just about now. So I wanted to start with saying hello to everyone. My name is Roland. Roland Pacheco. I'm the Tribal Engagement Coordinator here at Tree People. And so I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time this afternoon to join us. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So I just wanted to introduce myself and saying welcome, and I will pass it along to our team that we're working with at Sacred Places Institute. Thank you.
And help if I unmute myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriela Lassos. I'm going to be doing the land acknowledgement today with, and my friend Jessa will be doing the grounding with us today. So I will go ahead and start with the land acknowledgement. Give me a second to prepare myself because I lost the little tab. You know what? I don't know where it went. There it is. Okay. Miha Wenehinken Netwanya Ne Gabriela Lassos Tongvet Neha. Hello, all my relatives. My name is Gabriela Lassos, and I am Tongva. And to begin this acknowledgement, I would like to share with you the significance of acknowledging those whose ancestral homelands, whose ancestral homelands and who are the traditional stewards of the land that we live on. Land acknowledgement is practiced formally to recognize and respect Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the territory that we inhabit. Land acknowledgement is also the first step in educating ourselves on building a deeper and more meaningful decolonized relationship with Native peoples and the land itself. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and a connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. Indigenous people across the United States still live in relative invisibility. This invisibility is due to a multitude of factors, including cultural and historical erasure. Across the country, Natives are fighting for reparations, land return, recognition, and their sovereignty, but the American public continues to hear very little about these battles. The land that we live on today was not willingly given up by those who tended to it centuries ago. And because of this, we must consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. I would like to share a website with you. I hopefully can get dropped in the chat by one of my colleagues. And it's going to be the Native American Heritage Commission map of California tribes. As you open this website, you'll see a little disclaimer. I ask that you read it and consider that as you continue to learn about whose homelands, consider that disclaimer as you continue to learn about whose homelands you are residing on. This website allows you to see whose native lands you're residing on wherever you are in this remote environment. And utilizing this resource allows you to begin understanding the scope of colonization and the groups that directly affected by it. If you're comfortable doing so in the chat, you can feel free to add whose ancestral lands you reside on today. Thank you so much for allowing me to share this time with you. Awesh Koneha. And I will go ahead and pass it on to Jessa for our grounding.
Awesh Koneha, Gabriela. Mi'i hawenihinkam natwanyane Jessa Calderon tongvet neha koi mixkanakan koi yoeme. Hello, my relatives. I am Jessa Calderon and I am Tongva Chumash as well as Yoeme, and I am happy to be here with you all today. So for this grounding exercise, you can choose to participate or not. And if you would like to participate and would like to have your camera off, that's okay. I'm gonna have you close your eyes and take a deep breath in through the nose, breathing in for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and holding in for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Exhaling out through your mouth for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, breathing in through your nose, breathing in positive, loving, healing energy, and allowing that positive, loving, healing energy to be felt throughout the entire body, releasing any and all stagnant energy that no longer serves the body out through the mouth as you exhale. And again, breathing in through your nose and allowing that positive, loving, healing energy to be felt in the neck and shoulders, releasing any and all tension in the shoulders, feeling the body calm and relax, and exhale that breath out through your mouth. And as you hear me continue to speak, continue to breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth, with the understanding that every breath in is a breath of positive, loving, healing energy, which hugs every cell in the body, pulling love into the body and releasing stagnant energy that is no longer needed out through the mouth. I'm going to ask that you focus your attention at the base of your spine and at the front of the body from the base of the spine. Visualize a clock visualize a clock facing the wall in front of you from the front of your body, and this beautiful light coming in through that clock and moving from the 1 to the 3 to the 6 to the 9 to the 12. It's a beautiful red light channeling through the front of the body and out through the back. And as this light channels through, it begins to release any and all blockages, removing any anger, any fear, allowing us to feel completely stable and grounded, allowing us to be stable mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and financially. And from the same area at the base of the spine, visualize roots like that of the tree, growing down from the base of the spine into the floor beneath us, deep into the earth. We place our roots, allowing these roots to grow deeper, longer, wider, and stronger. And as these roots are placed into the earth, we feel even more stable and even more grounded, allowing the unconditional, loving, healing energy of the earth to pulsate up these roots and pulsate throughout our entire body. We feel the love of the earth. We begin to understand our connection and understand that no matter where we find ourselves in position today, the earth has always provided for us, always provided food, clean, drinkable water, and shelter. And the way that the earth provides for us, we begin to remember our responsibility of how it is our position to guide, protect all of our relatives on this earth and care for our Mother Earth the way that she has cared for us. Another deep breath in through the nose, remembering who we are, remembering our reason for being, exhaling out through the mouth and allowing ourselves to be fully present in this moment here and now with an open heart and an open mind. And when you're ready, please open your eyes and join us in this session. Awash koneha for those of you that did participate. And I will pass it on to Angela. Or I'm sorry, is it Marita I'm passing it to?
Yes, thank you, Tlaskamati. Greetings, Piali no Chime. Hello, everyone. Nanotoka Maritza. My name is Maritza, and I am calling in or here visiting from Tongva traditional territories. Thank you, Jessa, for that grounding. It was incredibly helpful. I hope so for everyone as well. And I want to just quickly go over the community agreements. As many of you are aware here who are pretty conscious, it's important to begin with community agreements so that we all harmoniously participate and keep our minds open to what we're about to share. So as it says, keep an open mind and heart. One mic, be respectful and allow others to finish their thoughts. So if you have any questions at hand, please write them down if they're burning, but you might have to hold until we choose you to share your questions. Be mindful of the space that you're taking. Let's be mindful that everybody gets an opportunity to share. Use the raise hand button if you wish to speak. And as I always remind myself, make sure to turn that raise hand button off once you're done. And be conscious of intent versus the impact. So it's really important. Oh, okay, well, we're going to move on to the agenda now. Oh, okay. I guess not. Let's finish up then quickly. Dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone. And liberation is possible. If we keep, all of us keep that in mind, we'll come out with better solutions for everyone. And give credit where it is due, always. And be your own boo, basically, you know, lick your own wounds. So let's move on then. We're gonna get into the agenda and what we're gonna be covering today. Introductions by SPI and Tree People. We're going to cover in the first section water, culture, and origin, providing indigenous context. In the next section, we'll cover capitalism, colonialism, commodification, and contamination. So basically the 4 C's. And then in the next section, we're working with Native nations and indigenous peoples today. And then what does allyship look like? What can it look like? And then we'll close. So welcome everyone and thank you.
Thank you for that, Maritza, and thank you, Gabriela, for the land acknowledgement, and Jessa for that grounding. So I'm Angela Mooney, DRC. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples. Really excited to be here with you all. You will get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation as part of the follow-up from this training. So I'm not going to go through everyone's bios. They're all amazing and fabulous and experts in their own right. And you can learn more about us in the PowerPoint when you receive it. And so with that, I'll see if Roland or anyone from Tree People's team wants to say a couple of words about Tree People before we launch into the content.
Sure thing. Thank you, Angela. So yeah, Tree People has endeavored recently and been working in partnership with Sacred Places Institute on this program. And for me in particular, it was an exciting opportunity to, you know, work with and for my people. And so this was an incredibly, you know, unique opportunity that I was excited for. And so it's been really fulfilling. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. So with that, we will turn it over to Jessa to get us started in our curriculum today.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us once again. And let's go ahead and get started. I gotta pull my tab up too. Okay. So as we locate ourselves, I'm acknowledging that we are speaking of the river, the Los Angeles River, which stems from the waters of the Simi Hills and Santa Susana Mountains, with tributaries streaming from the San Gabriel Mountains. This river was and is an important means to us. It was an important means to travel, a rich food source, a gathering place for ceremonial purposes, as well as a place to gather basket materials and much more. Tongva families understood the fresh water was a necessity, therefore they contributed to a healthy ecosystem to sustain all life in and around the river. We view water as a living entity. We understand water is an energy source. We acknowledge the life in the river, the life that was once in the river was salmon, trout, and many more animals that lived off of and within the water, as well as our plant relatives that lived pretty much in and around as well. Our indigenous peoples understand that the land waters have always had its natural cleansing and healing system. From the rocks, the pebbles, the sand, the plant roots, which contain energy, all of those contain energy and give the water healing qualities. Also, the rocks, pebbles, sand, dirt, and plant roots are also a natural cleansing system that work together. The rock, sand, roots, and water are a place for many species of life to thrive as well. When the damming occurs, it creates stagnancy. The water's natural cleansing system is removed, causing the water to become easily infected with disease, such as deadly algae, and causing the natural life, such as fish, to die off. When contaminants are poured into the water, it also causes disease, disease causing death and harm to any living beings who would and do rely on this water source. Trying to understand the relationships and the reciprocity that the indigenous people understood well. Relationships between plants, roots, rocks, pebbles, to the dirt, to the sand, and how they all tie into the natural cleansing system and work together, like I previously described. The responsibility as human beings that we have been taught. Our responsibility has always been to care for the plants and the river. It has always been our position to maintain healthy relationships with the water, the animal life within the water, and all life surrounding the water. We understand the power of importance of vibration and intention, and always taking only what we need. Our people knew that vibration was an important part of life. Every form of life is vibrating and tuning into vibrations, causing different reactions. When one has good and loving intentions, they release good and loving vibrations outside of themselves. The intention of prayers going into paddling the rivers, bathing and drinking the energetically charged and naturally systemically cleaned water. The prayers going into collecting the food in or near the water, collecting materials for common uses, it all contributed to maintaining a healthy, vibrating ecosystem. We all sang to each other and kept the loving vibrations high and pure. We all had good intentions behind our actions and made sure to do our part in keeping one another healthy. To take only what you need has been a teaching we still live by today. When people came here with the intention to steal, kill, and take with malintent and bad vibrations, the healthy ecosystem as we knew it for thousands of years began to shift in less than 100 years into the sick ecosystem we surround ourselves with today. It's not enough to talk about it like the partner who's sorry with promises to change tomorrow. It's beyond time to get back to our practices. Although we are far behind to revitalizing the practice of healthy relationship and reciprocity, if we continue to make excuses as if we could never get back there, meanwhile continuing to overindulge and overdevelop, we will surely completely devastate our homelands. And so we do ask you to think about, and you can also put in the chat box, what are some ways that you practice respecting water? And if you like to describe what water as a living entity means to you, and or you can also describe what water as an energy source means to you. Thank you so much, and I will pause for questions. And if no questions, if there are any questions that come up, you can put them in the chat box if you don't have any at this moment. And if there are no questions, I will go ahead and pass it over to one of my colleagues.
Hello again, everyone. I am gonna give another like 30 seconds for questions if anybody has anything. I'm apologizing to all of my colleagues for my inability to stop clicking the button. But yeah, any more thoughts, comments, questions want to be shared? Okay, I'm going to move us on into the capitalism, settler colonialism, commodification, and contamination section. This is going to be a lot of videos and talking about those videos. If hopefully everyone was able to watch the video that was shared with you prior to this meeting. And if you weren't, I encourage you to go back and watch that, as well as the other video that we're going to be featuring in this section. So the first video that we featured is the aqueduct between us. The aqueduct between us first began as a panel discussion centering on the Department of Water and Power's long and documented history of extractive water practices within the Owens Valley. This film was produced and directed by Anne Marie Mendoza as well as Isaiah Mendoza, and it was produced over the course of 2 years and assembled from over 15 hours of footage. And its goal is to serve as an oral history detailing the shared experience of both Tongva and Paiute people and their relationship to water and how that water has been taken from them. I'm going to go ahead and play this clip, and then I will continue talking afterwards.
What we call our homeland is Payahunaru.
It's the place of flowing water. I would venture to say that most people coming up into the Owens Valley from Los Angeles would not really have that same descriptor to call this place. But it is what our people called it because it was a place of flowing water.
Our word for water is Paya. Paya is culturally significant to us because it's life. We believe it's a life force. We believe it is life in itself.
To us, water's sacred. We've always known that because when we spread our water, we created life.
We had the river running down at a huge lake at the bottom that they now call Owens Lake. We called it Patsiata. There was just this abundance of resources. It's not only food, it's your clothing, it's your house, it's your medicine, it's your basket material, everything, and it all depends on that water.
That little section we felt was important to share with you because it sort of ties back to what Jessa was saying about the importance of reciprocity and the importance of how water is the main source for all of the life around us, the life that sustains us. So it's just something to help put that into a little bit of perspective. The slide, all the text here is from Isaiah Mendoza, who also works for Sacred Places Institute. And he was willing to sort of put this here and share his experience. So I was reading off of it, but it's all kind of his experience that he had. Then I will move on to the next slide. So this is the video that should have been shared with you prior, Indigenous Voices on Sacred Waters. I am going to go ahead and play the clip, and then I will continue talking about it.
When these organizations and state agencies recognize that we are part of the conversation and not just a number in the back, it makes it really meaningful because it gets rid of that erasure factor. It's like saying, yes, you're here, you exist, and we want to hear what you have to say. But it also allows for Indigenous people to start to feel more comfortable talking to these agencies who have alienated them for so long, who have taken their land, who have done all of these things that have negatively impacted Indigenous people. It makes it hard because there's a lot of negative feelings towards these agencies because of all of that happened in the past. But that shouldn't stop these agencies from still trying to reach out and include us in the conversation.
But as we've been experiencing in reality, what this means for some state agencies is invite us to a tribal consultation meeting or roundtable and then check the box and call it a day.
We should be beyond the point where agencies think that all they have to do is sit in a room and let us tell them what we want to say, and then they can go off and do what they plan to do in the first place.
So as Tony Cordero was saying, a lot of agencies just like invite Indigenous people to the table and then check a box and then say, well, we invited them, they said something, let's keep doing what we originally planned to do, which is really frustrating, working in it with Indigenous people and Indigenous spaces, going out to those state agencies, hearing those like, oh, we want to listen to you, we want to help you, or we want to get your voice out. And then it just becomes, well, the Indigenous people said this, but in reality, they didn't say that. It was a twisted narrative to sort of help benefit their goals. I think but the main point of this video is basically to share Indigenous voices and perspectives on the way that state agencies are including them in talks on sacred waters. So state agencies play an important role in the connection between water and people. They, a lot of the time, are the way that people learn about where their water is coming from, or where the things that sustain them in their houses or apartments or just around them are sustaining them, where they come from. Allowing Indigenous people, especially from local tribes, like in LA, the Tongva or the Tataviam in North LA County, to have co-management opportunities allows the public to see Indigenous people as not a thing of the past. It's really important because all of the tribes in LA County are, or who have homelands in LA County, are not federally recognized. So it's kind of hard to put that in, like, say that, oh yeah, we're still here, because people don't see it as us having land or us having a reservation. Meaningful consultation and co-management is so much more important than the performative kind that a lot of agencies currently engage in. We'll discuss this a little bit later in terms of allyship, but meaningful consultation and co-management allows for trust between tribes and agencies to be built. And that's a lot harder to build that trust than it is to break it, as we've seen with in a lot of situations. So I will go on to the next slide.
When
So this section is going to talk about the concretization of the river. Jessa and her son Honor say it pretty well, so I'm going to let them speak and then I'll go on.
And the channelization that they have contributed to is part of why we don't have our salmon and our freshwater relatives.
I mean, I would like to be more connected with my homelands, but with all the concrete and everything, it just doesn't feel right at all.
Yeah, so with the concretization of the river, it's kind of, people don't really see the river as a river anymore. They see it as like, oh, that thing, that divot has water in it today. It doesn't have water in it every day, but look, there's like a little stream. And it's just been, it really creates a disconnect. The denaturalization of the river has been for the benefit of the growth of Los Angeles, the city of LA. And now that we're here where we are, we're kind of seeing that it was beneficial for the settlers back then, but in reality, it's kind of hurting us now, not to have the animals that used to run through the river and all of the natural aspects that were there prior to concretization. An effort to stop yearly flooding has disrupted nature and has led to many native plants and animals disappearing from the LA River and within LA. And the concrete also, like I said before, creates a disconnect between the people of LA and the river, because they no longer see the river as a body of water. They see it as a piece of infrastructure. Yeah, move forward.
And
so what comes along with this is the outsourcing of water. With the concretization of the river, it was a lot easier to channel, sorry. The concretization of the river led to a lot of it becoming leading into channels and having water movement from places that we wouldn't have originally had it. So that's sort of what's discussed in the aqueduct between us, is just water coming from places different than its original source, and us not realizing that the water that we have here in Los Angeles isn't necessarily water from Los Angeles, if that makes sense. So I'll go ahead and play the video.
Representatives of the city of Los Angeles entered the city in arguably very shiesty ways. They very much came in hidden, disguised as local new families that were moving, and buying up land as though they were going to come and live here. Only later on did the local people find out that they were under the guise of a much bigger plan and agenda.
For 1895, Mulholland, Eaton, and Lippincott come here. But they wanted water for LA, because LA outgrew the LA River. Once it hit the population of 250,000 people, they knew that they needed more water for LA to get bigger. And that's where they got the idea of building LA Aqueduct.
In 1904, William Mulholland and Fred Eaton began purchasing land in the Owens Valley. In 1905, there was a bond that the city of Los Angeles approved to construct the aqueduct, so it all happened rather quickly. The construction began in 1908, and it was completed in 1913, I believe. And then during that same time period, in 1912, President Taft set aside over 67,000 acres for possible reservation for the Indians.
Lands that were set aside for us were higher up on the fan and really were key places for moving water, which is why they really wanted those lands for Los Angeles to be able to control. And LA in the 30s did a series of reports to document the conditions of the people that were living here. The title of it says it all. We were the Indian problem.
That just ties into the colonization aspect of how Indigenous people were seen as less. I don't know if everybody was able to read the quotes that were being shared in the video on the screen, but it was just, we were Native Americans in the state of California, across the state, were seen as uncivilized, as savages, as the US in the past like to call natives. But it's really frustrating to hear that, because they took care of the water, they took care of the area around the water, and they were forced to move and be put on a reservation and not have access to the same things that they had before. Forced movement of the water is like the concretization for the benefit of settlers and to allow more people to settle in Los Angeles. Outsourcing of water is important to keep in mind today, especially because a lot of our reservoirs around us are drying up. I think it's really important to keep the Colorado River in mind and Lake Mead, and how different states agreed on sharing that water. And now that there's almost no water, everybody's fighting over that water. And it's important to keep in mind that the Colorado River does run into Mexico, and there's no water running into Mexico anymore. So all of the Indigenous people that are living in Mexico on the river don't have that water, don't have what they need to sustain themselves anymore. So that's really a frustrating thing. And as we move water to us, it's important to keep in mind that more often than not, we are taking water from someone else who needs it. It's hard because in California, when it's not raining, where are we going to get the water from? So it's just a matter of trying to figure out best practices and try to minimize the amount of people that we negatively impact as we look for water sources and try to sustain ourselves.
Represent.
So once again, like, where does your water come from? It's important to know where your water comes from so that you can properly show respect to the water itself. Keeping in mind that the water is not willingly flowing into your home, it is being forced to do so because of the infrastructure that's in place, is really important. Reconnection with water will help you understand why it's sacred and not something that we should be wasting. It's a little frustrating because when we're working with our communities as agencies, we're seeing a lot of people saying, well, how come people in wealthier affluent areas can just waste water while we're on tight schedules of when we can water our lawns or run the power or have anything, where there's people living in the more affluent areas that are just wasting it, and they're like, oh, I'm going to water my lawn anyway. So it's important to sort of keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and play this video, and then I think we'll go ahead and move on to questions.
If you go into somebody else's home, you're a guest, and you treat their home in a manner that's respectful. Instead of saying, well, no, I don't agree with the way that this is set up. You know, I want to transform your house because it's not beneficial to me. That's exactly what the colonizers have done in California. They've looked at our home and said, this is not beneficial, the way things are set up, the way that the river floods yearly. So we need to transform it. We need to change it in order for it to be beneficial for us. So the answer is to change our entire perspective of the environment, to view ourselves as guests to the land. That we're only here for a small, incredibly small time on this planet. Even as the race of human beings, we're only here for a small time on this planet. And the world transform, and it's always been in transformation. And the solution is that we can be guests of the land, that we can be guests of the tribal nations, that we don't have to force either into submission, that they can exist on their own, that the land has power, the land has spirit, and that we should take that into consideration with what we do, the way we live.
Yeah, so we can go ahead and move on to questions. I just am really thankful for all of you being here. There's some stuff in the chat, and I will look at what that is. A question from Trina is, what are some ways that we can reconnect with water? I think I'm going to open the floor to my colleagues as well, but I think one way to help you sort of get in the practice of it is just thanking the water every time, every morning when you take a shower or take your first drink of water. It's really important because if you're acknowledging that that water is there for you, it helps you sort of realize that, like, oh wait, I'm leaving the faucet on, I'm leaving this on. And it's making you more aware of what you're doing with and around water. I hope that made sense, but I'm going to open the floor to my colleagues.
Yeah, one suggestion I would make is if you can't sit next to a body of water, such as a pond or a river or a waterfall, just to sit with that water and just quietly identify with that body of water, that, you know, there's power in that, you can feel the energy. Then get a small glass of water and, you know, take it with you for the day. Let it sit next to your head while you sleep. If you can have like a table next to you or something, you know, but keep it near you while you sleep, and identify that water previous to colonization or colonial ways is a living entity. I have been told by some of my elders that when they process it, they diminish its energy. You know, it's kind of like, well, I don't know really what to compare it with without sounding harsh, but it diminishes its energy, so it's not as potent and powerful as a relative as if you were to allow water to take its natural form. So I would suggest trying something like that to better understand water as a relative.
If I can add to that, you know, I think that, I think, Jessa, you may have covered this too in other presentations as well. But there is, in my limited experience in ceremonies, fasting, or in sweat lodges, you go without water in different ceremonies for many reasons. And one is to be reminded of the value of water and to be able to build endurance without water. So perhaps many may not be able to participate in the different ceremonies of different indigenous communities, but if you can go out, you know, a day without water, just to see or to feel and understand truly how much you rely on it, I think that may help to shift the perspective and strengthen your appreciation for it. And if you could do 4 days, I would say do 4 days. You know, that's what fasting does as well, right? We're reminded of how we really, actually, it humbles us, you know, to remind us that we're all connected and we should all appreciate each other from every form of life.
Thank you. I'm going to go on to the next question I see in the chat, which is to explain a little bit more about the concept of Puyam. So Kuyum is a Tonga word for guest, and it's utilized in the article by Charles Sepulveda, which you'll have a link to once you get this presentation in the resources section. Charles Sepulveda is a Tonga and a Hashiman scholar, and in his article, Our Sacred Waters, Theorizing Kuyum as a Decolonial Possibility, he asked the question, what does it mean to be a guest on Indigenous land? Particularly in this moment when, there are so many guests, right? The guests on our tribal homelands outnumber the Indigenous people by the millions, right? And so I think, in any culture, wherever you're from around the world, whatever community you grew up in, whatever class background, there are certain standards around how one is to behave when you're a guest in someone else's home. And these are standards that young children, as young as 5 years old, know. We could go to any kindergarten class in the United States and say, provide them with a series of actions and ask them to distinguish which of those actions were rude and which of those actions were good behavior when you're being a guest. And so, that's the beauty of Charles's use of this word Kuyum, is it's relatively, everyone has a baseline from their own life and their own lived experiences that they can use to assess whether or not they're being rude or they're being a good guest. I think, the issue and why we started this talk with the grounding and the background and the Indigenous perspective context offered by Jessa is that it may be challenging for people to translate those principles around being a good guest and good behavior and bad behavior when it comes to something like land. One of our elders and Sacred Places Institute board members, Richard Bussey, says, the difference between settler colonial societies and Native societies is that for us, nature is home and the house is where you go to sleep. For settler colonial societies, nature is the other thing to be seen, and inside is your home. And I think that's maybe the best way for me, at least, to understand that, is that, the home in this instance is the nature. It is the place, it is the water. And so just asking yourself, how can you be a better relative or guest to these lands and waters? And I'll pause there to see if anyone else has any thoughts and see what other questions might have arisen in the chat. If no one else has any thoughts on Kuyum, I see one final question here. What organizations and groups do you have attending water agency meetings throughout the San Gabriel Valley and Pomona Valley, and how can people connect with them to get involved? This is something that I think we'll get into more later in the presentation, but one of the major issues is capacity, right? And for those of you that were able to watch the video, one of the elders in the video, Alan Salazar, speaks to that point quite poignantly when he says there are 800 Tataviam members and not one of them is wealthy. They're all working class and they're all just one paycheck away from not being able to pay rent. And that is something I think particularly in the context of Southern California, where you do have some federally recognized tribal nations that have been quite successful economically. There's a misunderstanding and a lot of misconceptions about the capacity and the resources available to Native nations. And so, yes, in all these water districts, it would be ideal to have Tongva and other tribal representation, depending on where these are located. But how is that possible when people are working 2 or 3 jobs full-time and caring for children and caring for elders and leading their nation? What is the place of Indigenous peoples in LA County are very, very full. And so part of what we're hoping to accomplish here at these trainings today is to really get agencies and organizations that hope to be better allies to think in the long term about what that means. How can you add line items to your budget so that there's always space to bring in local tribal community members and compensate them fairly for their expertise? And so that's just one suggestion. Like I said, we'll get into this more later in the talk, but does anyone else have any thoughts before we move on? All right, well, feel free to go ahead and just drop those questions in the chat as they arise. And let's go ahead, and if you can move us on, Gabriela, we'll get started with working with Native nations and Indigenous peoples today. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, and then when I'm done with my section, we'll pause and give you all a 5-minute break, and then Maritza will take over, and we'll talk about the rights of the river, and then we'll move on to the conversation about allyship before we wrap up. Next slide, please. So I always like to start with this because I think in my experience in the environmental movement, and particularly in water spaces, you have many people for whom this is a lifelong endeavor. Maybe many of the people that are participating in this talk today, this may be your career working on water. And that's wonderful and beautiful and important, and means that you have certain levels of expertise. But why I start with this photo is because the majority of people in these pictures are actually no longer alive. They're elders who have passed on and who are now ancestors. And this is who I learned about water from. This is who directed me to focus on empowering my nation and other tribal nations. The photo in the center is of my cousin, David Gallardis, the former tribal chair for our nation. And one of the last things he did before he passed away from cancer was schedule a meeting between him and me and one of his friends from childhood who happened to work for a local water agency. It was that important to him that our water issues be addressed. And I think that for agencies and organizations that are participating in this training, if there's one thing you can take away, it's that piece about humility. Because however long you've been doing this work and however much education and experience you have, it likely can't even come close to what tribal intergenerational knowledge is, right? These folks have been fighting to protect our waters and protect our homeland since the point of colonization. And so you're dealing with intergenerational folks for whom this isn't just a lifetime effort, this is multiple lifetimes of work. Next slide, please. And you've seen some maps, which are great. I just like to provide this as context because many people don't understand how unique California is in terms of how many Native nations are in California. There are over 150 Native nations. And that's important for folks to understand. No matter where you're at, you are on some tribe's ancestral homeland. Next slide, please. This route, and I'll get into this a little bit later in my presentation, but this is the route that colonization took in California. One of my elders, because I used to really grapple with the question and wonder why it was that tribal nations in the far north, like near the Oregon border, had so much more of, from my perspective, vibrant histories of activism and resistance in contemporary times, particularly around water. And I would talk to my elder and say, how come we're not like that down here? And she would say, it's 150 years. And I didn't understand what she meant. And what she meant by that is for those of our tribal nations that are from Southern California, we experienced the violence of colonialism 150 years before our relatives in the north, because the Spanish came up from the south. And so that's 150 years less time that we had to develop our cultures and protect our languages and pass on our traditions to our children. And that 150 years becomes really critical when we think about places like Los Angeles County and what that means both in terms of Indigenous loss, but also Indigenous resilience. Next slide, please. This is a slide that I always go back and forth on whether or not to use because of its violence, right? I was just on a meeting earlier with a group of California Indigenous folks working on an exhibition called Reclaiming Camino, or reclaiming, the highway, that route that you just saw a map of before. And it's a painful group to be a part of because we're talking about all of these specific acts of violence that were done to our people. And really, for anyone who's working on justice, equity, diversity and inclusion, racial justice, understanding Indigenous nations and indigeneity more, if we want to talk about how to dismantle white supremacist culture and institutional racism, we really have to go back to the beginning. And that beginning is the doctrine of discovery. These papal bulls in the 1400s, issued by various popes, provide the justification, spiritual justification, one might argue, for enslavement, for the transatlantic slave trade, and the mass genocide that took place throughout the Americas. And this second slide talks about manifest destiny. When I taught for about 15 years throughout the UC system, and I would often have classes that had 100 or 200 students in them, and I would always ask folks to raise their hand on the first day if they could identify the names of the Native nations on whose ancestral homelands they lived and went to school. And virtually no hands in the class ever went up, even when I had 200 or 300 students. And then I would ask them to raise their hand if they can define manifest destiny. And pretty much every hand in the room would go up. And then I would say, it's precisely because you can answer the second question is why you don't have an answer to the first. And what I mean by that is that the project of genocide isn't just a project of physical genocide and extermination. It's also a project of legal and political and mental genocide and erasure, right? And so that's a big part of what we're dealing with here. The photograph in the center is not an old photograph. This is a photograph that was taken 2 years ago on the campus of Chapman University, which is within the shared ancestral territory of the Allyship and Tonga people. It was the first time that Chapman University had offered an environmental justice course. And I was elated that they reached out to me as an Allyship person to teach it. I thought that was really important, that the first time an environmental justice class was taught on this campus, it would be taught by someone from one of the local tribes. And about a month into teaching, it was all online because it was during COVID, but about a month into teaching, all of the faculty got this notice of this photograph because these images had been posted all over campus. And so I share this here because I think one of the things that I encounter often in working with agencies is this idea that, well, yeah, the genocide, all that happened a long time ago, but now we're here in contemporary times and it's time to move on, right? It is time to move on, and we can't do that when this kind of, white supremacist, racist culture is still very much a part of contemporary society, and it's something we're not talking about. And so I include that image with these two definitions so that we can all hopefully have a better understanding between the link to the past and where we're at contemporarily. Next slide, please. And this will be clearer when you can see it in the PowerPoint. It's kind of unclear here, or small at least for my older eyes. But what this is a list of the private militias and their Indian hunting expeditions in California. And in the first column is how much money these private militias spent hunting and exterminating California Indians. And in the second column is the amount of money that the state of California reimbursed those private militias. And the third column is the amount that the United States government then reimbursed the state. This is really important to understand, especially those of you that work for state or regional agencies, because the attempted genocide of California indigenous people was not just something fomented by private citizens, by miners, by people wishing to extract gold and oil from our homeland. It was facilitated and prompted by private actors, and it was then supported and funded by the state and federal government. And so, from my perspective, if you work for a state agency, we're at the total of, I think, 140 million in contemporary dollars is what the state of California spent. When the state of California provides resources totaling 140 million to every tribe in the state, then we can start talking about moving forward. But there's a lot that needs to happen before we're at that point. Next slide, please. And these are the series of laws passed right after California became a part of the United States. And these are the laws that actually made it legal to enslave California Indian people, to purchase California Indian children and adults. And many of these laws actually weren't completely eradicated from the book until the 1910s, which means that there are people alive today who knew people that were alive when it was still legal to enslave our ancestors. And again, I'm just trying to get through the point of continuity here and what that intergenerational trauma over the span of centuries means in terms of how you're going to interact with Native nations today. Next slide, please. This is a quote from a Tongva and a Hashimam elder and artist, L. Frank Manriquez, specifically speaking about Los Angeles. And I think often in places like Los Angeles and Orange County that are so urbanized, it's become really challenging for people to understand what, how is this indigenous land still? And so I think this quote is powerful because it speaks to that. Where you may see buildings and parking structures, we see holy sites and the burial grounds of our ancestors. Next slide, please. And now I want to talk a little bit about self-determination, sovereignty, government-to-government consultation, and also what it means to be federally recognized or non-federally recognized tribes. If you recall from the map of the route of El Camino Real or the route of colonization in California, that route coincides with where there are non-federally recognized tribes. And by that, I mean on the entire coast of California, all the way up to San Francisco, basically everywhere a mission was established. From the border of San Diego to San Francisco, there are only 2 federally recognized tribal nations along the coast. That's Saninas, Banda Chumash Indians, and some of the Kumeyaay nations. And so what that means is there's a direct correlation between how long indigenous peoples in California have been experiencing colonization and whether or not our sovereign nations are recognized as such by the federal government. So self-determination, according to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And now I want to make a distinction between tribal sovereignty and then the term that we'll get to in a minute, indigenous sovereignty. And this is from the Indigenous Environmental Network, which is one of the oldest and most responsive grassroots indigenous-led environmental organizations in the country. So tribal sovereignty, as you most often likely hear it, refers to legal recognition in the United States of America, law of inherent sovereignty of American Indian nations. The law applied to American Indians by the U.S. government is called federal Indian law. Although it's undermined by various acts, legal decisions, and policies, it still stands to this day. Indian reservations are recognized as what can be termed nations within, and each has its own government and sovereign powers to make laws, etc. Most also have their own tribal justice system. Next slide, please. So tribal sovereignty is like a legal term that applies specifically in that context to federally recognized tribes with lands over which they can assert legal jurisdiction. Indigenous sovereignty is what we are talking about in California and what is most applicable to California indigenous nations. Indigenous sovereignty is distinguishable from tribal sovereignty in that it is not a nation-state recognition of inherent sovereignty under nation-state dominion. Rather, it arises from indigenous traditional knowledge and belongs to each indigenous nation, tribe, First Nation, consisting of spiritual ways, culture, language, social and legal systems, political structures, and inherent relationships with lands and waters. And the key point here is inherent. Sovereignty is not something that any government agency can designate. Indigenous nations are sovereign, and whether or not nation states or settler colonial governments choose to recognize our sovereignty is a different issue. But that sovereignty is inherent, and it's inherent because our nations have existed for thousands of years before colonization ever landed on the shores. And the other important thing to remember here is that indigenous sovereignty exists regardless of what the nation state does or does not do, and it continues as long as the people are a part of it. Continues. And so that's where we're at today in terms of sovereignty in places like Los Angeles. Next slide, please. And I want to talk a bit about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Many people can undermine or discount the value of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples because it's not a treaty that's internationally binding law, right? But it's a critical document in that it was developed with and by and in collaboration with Indigenous peoples around the world. And so the demands and terms and articulations around rights that are enumerated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are really, I think, in an international context, the closest you can get to an iteration of what Indigenous peoples want and how we would define our rights. Next slide, please. These slides talk about the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, which if you were able to watch the film that we shared, is something that I talked about both in the context of the Me Too movement, but also about how we can translate our collective understanding of consent to operationalize this rubric of free, prior, and informed consent in agency and government dealings with Native nations. And a lot of times people get really scared when they hear something like consent. Oh, we can't do that. That's too much, right? But is it really? And again, because as a society, we understand that consent is necessary. You can't have a standard other than consent when you're talking about relations between people, right? And so we should apply that same understanding to thinking about consent when we're talking about Native nations and what we're doing in terms of water planning in their homeland. Next slide, please. And this is critical as well. Article 25, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. So regardless of whether or not tribes, quote unquote, own their traditional lands and waters today, we still have the right to maintain and strengthen these unique relationships for future generations. And that's a key part of it again as well. Remember, one of the themes I started with is the theme about intergenerational knowledge. And that's a theme that should always be present in your thinking about how to work with Indigenous nations. Next slide. So I wanted to name these federal laws. We don't have a lot of time today, so I'm not going to talk about these in depth, but and also because as a word about the distinction between federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes, the United States only believes itself to have certain legal obligations to federally recognized tribes. So in Los Angeles and Orange County and most of Southern California, there are no federally recognized tribes on the coast, which means that in general, these laws and their standards and directives around government consultation are not mandatory when it comes to many of the Native nations or all of the Native nations that you would be working with in LA County. But these laws are important and provide a framework for the protection of Native American religious freedom, historical resources, and environmental justice. Next slide, please. California Native American Heritage Commission is an entity that all of you should be aware of. I was just on a meeting with a Joint Powers Authority entity earlier this morning, who's been in existence for at least 20 years and who holds title to thousands and thousands of acres of land. And at the end of my public comments, they asked if I could please provide them with the contact list of all the tribal governments for the area where they work. And I was diplomatic in that meeting, but I was quite frankly a little shocked and saddened to know that an agency that maintains title to thousands of acres of land, of open space in tribal homelands, and who's been around for 20 years, was asking me as the head of a small grassroots organization to provide contact info for tribal governments. And in this day and age, there's really no excuse for that because everything's online. All you have to do is Google California Native American Heritage Commission, and you can get their contact info and reach out to them, and they will tell you who are the tribal contacts in the area where you live and work. Next slide. So two of the other executive orders that are going to be really critical to, or should be informing all of your work with tribes, and really anyone in your agency whose job it is to be a tribal liaison, should read these executive orders in full. Executive Order B1011 was passed by Governor Brown, and that's the directive that ordered all state agencies under executive control to develop in writing tribal consultation policy. And so any agency that falls under the purview of executive control in California at this point should have a robust tribal consultation policy in place. The other important thing about this executive order is that it codified the fact that in California, California Native American tribes includes all federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes. I'm going to say that again. In California, California Native American tribes includes all federally recognized and non-federally recognized California tribes. I said that twice. I could actually say it a million more times because I cannot tell you the number of times I have heard from tribal community members and then directly from local agencies, oh, well, we only have to consult with federally recognized tribes. Folks, if you live and work in California or live and work for a California organization, that is patently false. You absolutely have a duty to consult on a government-to-government basis with California Native American tribes. And I'll say as well here, I'm sure it'll come up a little bit later, tribes are not stakeholders. If you have any documentation or any materials that talk about stakeholders and include tribes in that category, I would strongly encourage you to revamp those materials, because tribal nations are sovereign nations with whom there's a legal duty to engage in government-to-government consultation. And that is not the same thing as a stakeholder. The other executive order here that's important is Governor Newsom's executive order, which is the first time the state has officially apologized on behalf of the state for the state-sponsored attempted genocide. Next slide, please. The SB 18 Traditional Tribal Cultural Places Bill was adopted in 2014. That was the first state law that codified the importance of respectful government-to-government consultation in all planning that's happening on tribal and ancestral lands. Next slide. And AB 52, which is also known as the amendment to CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, was adopted in 2014. And it recognizes California tribes' expertise regarding cultural resources and provides a method for agencies to incorporate tribal knowledge into their CEQA environmental review. What's important to note here is that, again, the term California Native American tribe means all federally recognized and non-recognized tribes in California. Next slide, please. And I wanted to wrap up this section before we take a break, talking about the Department of Water Resources policy, and then in a minute, the Water Board agency policy. So DWR's policy is that California Native American tribal governments and tribal communities have sovereign authority over their members and territory and a unique relationship with California's resources. California tribes and tribal communities, whether federally recognized or not, have distinct cultural, spiritual, environmental, economic, and public health interests and valuable cultural knowledge about California resources. And so again, you're hearing at the state level, or you're seeing this continuity around what's included in that definition of California Native American tribe. Next slide, please. And the California Water Board tribal consultation policy is to develop effective communication with all California Native American tribes that allows for meaningful participation and input when developing or revising the Water Board's regulations, rules, policies, or programs that may impact tribes. And so you have in this framework from two separate entities, very clear articulation of a commitment to government consultation and to meaningfully involve California Native nations in water planning within their ancestral homeland. And so for those of you that work locally, I think, these are good things for you to cite if you run into any sort of tension or resistance at the local level to do your due diligence and engage in the appropriate consultation with tribes. Next slide, please. And I wanted to conclude this section talking or just naming briefly tribal beneficial uses. And this is something that the California Indian Environmental Alliance started working on probably 10 years ago. And it's nice to see it coming to fruition. As many of you are probably aware, LA County Water Board recently adopted tribal beneficial use, cultural use is now recognized as a beneficial use. And so that's happening across the state. And where things are at locally now is that, it needs to be determined in consultation with the local tribe, what is the parameter of those beneficial cultural uses and the specificity of that. And I think, let me see, is there one more slide here, or am I going to take us to? Oh, yeah, I guess I put this out of order. I did want to note, since I talked about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples earlier, is that UNDRIP has actually been adopted in California. It was adopted the same time that AB 52 was adopted. And so this is another thing that I provide for those of you who want to be allies. There is some framework, institutional framework to support the utilization of the free, prior, and informed consent as the standard of engagement with tribal nations. Next slide. And actually, I should have put the break section in here. So I'm going to pause there and look at the chat since a lot of things have been coming through, and see if anybody has any questions before we take a short break and then hear from Marisa. Let's see. Oh, nice. Thank you for sharing that on the document discovery. It looks like some people had to leave. So I'm not seeing any new questions. Does anybody have any new questions or reflections or anything they want to share about my presentation before we go to a short break?
Looks like there was just one more added in the chat, Angela, about policies that exist in relation to tribal land returns.
Yes, that's one of my favorite questions. Thank you for asking. There are actually a lot of policies related to tribal land return. And anyone who wants to be an ally and wants to help us get some of these policies passed at the local level, I'm here for it. Call up SPI and we will be on your team to make that happen. At the state level, actually, the California Public Utilities Commission is the first state level agency to adopt a tribal land return policy. They adopted their policy, I want to say, in maybe 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. And an important piece of their policy is that they explicitly say that their prioritization of tribal land return is applicable to both federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes. You'll also note that in Newsom's executive order around California's 30 by 30 initiative, there's an acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty, a recognition of tribes as being the first and original stewards of California lands, and also a commitment to land return. And finally, in 2019, Governor Newsom adopted the state's, the administration's land return policy. And so officially, with that administrative land return policy, it is the policy of the state of California to prioritize land return to California tribes whenever they have so-called excess land that the state no longer wants. So hopefully that's helpful, and I believe we have links to some of those policies in the resources that will be shared with you after this presentation. Any other questions? All right, then, and feel free while we're on break to pop questions in the chat if you have any. It's 1:20 now, so come back and join us at 1:25 for Marisa's presentation. Okay, hi everyone. We're back. It is now 1:25. Can I get some thumbs up emojis or other indications that y'all are back in the room and ready to hear Maritza talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the water as a living entity with legal rights. All right, seeing lots of thumbs up. So Maritza, I will turn it over to you now.
Askamati, thank you, Angela. Thank you. And thank you, Jessa and Gabriela. So we're going to transition now, in a sense, almost stepping back, looking back at a wider global view of water as a living entity. And this is on the history of the legal rights of nature from the Western perspective. So in the Western perspective, it was in 1972 that Christopher Stone had an article. I believe he was a professor at USC. And he published an article, Should Trees Have Standing Toward Legal Rights for Natural Objects? This in turn propelled many of Westerners to consider that thought of, or contemplate the thought of nature or water or land as a living entity. And then you have a little bit of history there. In 2005, Navajo Nation Tribal Council drew upon the nation's previous codification of non-colonial, traditional, and customary law when it banned uranium mining. And then out here in the United States, you had in 2006, Tamaka, Baroque, Pennsylvania bans dumping of toxic sewage sludge as a violation of the rights of nature. So there's just examples there of how it has been used and in the history of how it has been used. But we're going to move on to the global movement of designating water as a living entity. You know, indigenous peoples from around the world, as you have been hearing from everyone here at SPI, on the importance of upholding indigenous principles of having a reciprocal relationship with all forms of life, which include water and land. Now, here we have the efforts of the indigenous communities, indigenous-led and organized communities of Ecuador. And that was the first country in the world in 2008 to recognize the rights of nature in its national constitution. If you could please play the video just to provide more context.
In Cochabamba, 30,000 people from over 100 countries came together for 1 week in April of 2010, calling for protecting the rights of Mother Earth and creating a document entitled The Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth.
Emprender el camino de la armonía con la naturaleza y el respeto a la vida. Requerimos forjar un nuevo sistema que restablezca la armonía con la naturaleza y entre los seres humanos. Solo puede haber equilibrio con la naturaleza si hay equidad entre los seres humanos.
I don't know that we're going to get a specific document that's going to work at the United Nations. What we're getting is this very, very strong alignment among people that this is a very important issue, and I think it'll start. I think what will come out of this is the issue will be part of discussions in national conventions. It'll be part of discussions in municipal discussions. Civil society is going to be activated out of this and is going to get really involved and make sure that this discussion about rights for nature and how to activate it will come out of this. It's going to come out of this conference for sure. There's going to be a lot of people engaged in this conversation.
Thank you. And so basically, it's just a little bit more of a global understanding of the coming together of many indigenous individuals from around the world. And therefore, as a result of that, designating the right of nature in their constitution in 2011, it was the first of many of the court decisions to issue the Vilcabamba River in Ecuador as having rights. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So as well, you know, this all, just to give a little bit more background, you know, as Angela was sharing and others, you know, the movement of indigenous peoples from around the world to protect land and waters and rights of nature has been going on since she mentioned, since colonization. There's been a real active movement in the United Nations, and every year coming together when they were drafting up the UNDRIP, there was a union of many indigenous communities coming together and dialoguing about the need and working within the legal structures within their homelands to create rights for nature and water. And so Bolivia as well, in 2010, also passed the law of rights of nature, or the rights of Mother Earth in this case. And these are just more examples of how this unity and work has been going on for some time now and continues till this day. Next slide, please. Now, this is basically a diagram of just, some examples of different bodies of water that different indigenous communities from around the world have been working on to, and have granted water the rights or of personhood or legal entity. In there you can see, I know it's kind of small for some, but you can see that we have India, we have New Zealand, we have Australia, we have Colombia, Ecuador, and basically each is led by indigenous communities. It is led by indigenous communities, and many in partnership with the local government entities, but it is directed and led by the local indigenous folks, and they decide how they wish to have it run or quote unquote managed. A lot of the times there'll be different councils that are part of the quote management of the river, but it may have two councils, one legal or advisory council, as in the case with the Australia. It'll have an advisory body council, but then that body council also looks to another tribal council for advice. So every tribal community will decide how that may look. And it's important to note that because, and more important here to note that, you can have many different communities from throughout even this country or in California designate or attempt to designate bodies of water as a living entity. But if that effort is not led and created by the local indigenous communities, that's not necessarily, in my opinion, it's really not going to reflect the true, protection of the body of water. So if we can move on to the next slide. Now here is an example of New Zealand. This is, I think we might have a little bit of time to play this video. There's so many great videos to play out there, but for the sake of time, I just wanted to share a little bit about how it happened in the chambers when this decision was made. If you could play the video, please.
It means that the river itself has the right not to be polluted. It has the right not to be degraded. It has the right not to be overdrawn before it can replenish itself.
And when I quote this particular bill, sir, they are in absolute awe as to how we have actually associated a river, a mighty river, and given it the identity of a person.
Now, you see that, you have the politicians in there that are, passing it, but really all of that happened because of the movement, because of the Maori indigenous movement in designating their river as a living entity. That's just, it was a huge win for New Zealand. First, it was designating a land area as a living entity, then it went on to the river. And that has set precedent for many other countries around the world to do the same. Can we move on to the next slide, please?
It means that the river...
Now, interestingly enough, out here, there's a ripple effect, if you may say, right, of when you set precedents and when you have other indigenous communities doing that, then we know that it is possible, even within this colonial context. These other countries around the world, indigenous folks have been colonized as well, and they're dealing with their colonial reality. But out here it can happen as well, and to different extents, and it looks different. So we have the Ponca Nation, for example, in Oklahoma, who passed a statute recognizing the rights of nature in response to their own struggle with fracking. And then on the White Earth Band, as of recent, the White Earth Band of Ojibwe adopted the rights of Manuming law to protect the legal rights of the rice or wild rice, which is heavily reliant on the freshwater resources. And, it's a subsistence. It's a critical form of sustenance for the Ojibwe bands. Next slide, please. Now let's come back home to California. And I'm sure many of you are already aware of this, but it's wonderful to hear that in 2019, the Yurok Tribal Council adopted the resolution granting the rights of personhood to the Klamath River. This is Northern California. And it's the first river in Northern America to have personhood rights declared. And as Angela was sharing, it was really important for everybody to understand the distinction between federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes, because that also determines the capacity of the tribe, whether you're federally recognized or not. And most non-federally recognized tribes do not have the capacity compared to a large or the largest, I believe, in a California indigenous tribe, such as the Yurok. But this is a wonderful, wonderful effort, along with the undamming efforts that they've been taking on. We can move on to the next slide, please. And as you know, their impetus, along with protecting our Mother Earth and the waters, to granting the river as a living entity, is also because there's a heavily reliance on the river for sustenance, as with the Ojibwe, with the wild rice. In this case, you have many of the coastal foods that are harvested and relied upon as a nutritional source for the continued existence and resistance and resiliency of the tribe. So here you have an example of the harvesting there of foods, and more than anything, again, it really is to ensure a reciprocal relationship for the health of humans and for the health of our Mother Earth. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of things to consider. This is just a really brief explanation of the rights of the river as a living entity, or the rights of nature and personhood. But there are things to consider. For example, protection principles that are utilized to inform statutory decision makers. In this case, the Yarra River in Australia. So there is, in deciding whether to grant a river or a body of land as a living entity, it really has to be driven by the indigenous principles, the values and the knowledge and the heritage, and ensuring that it involves traditional owners in the planning, the policy planning and decision making, as I stressed earlier. Otherwise, it's still really under colonial rule, settler neo-colonial rule. And we already know what that has caused and continues to cause. So post-settlement cultural diversity and heritage values are also embodied in the environmental, social, recreational, quote unquote, management and general protection principles. I always say quote management, because really management, like, that doesn't reflect a reciprocal relationship. When you are saying, as individuals who work in different water entities, to manage, it really does not entail the reciprocity or relationship. We don't manage a relationship with our loved ones. For the most part, we work together. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. And then there's implications and impacts to consider. One thing that is really, or there are many, but in this case, something to really consider that can be really mind-boggling is that, we're still working within colonial structures, and that can impose restrictions as well as threaten tribal sovereignty. Angela explained the difference between tribal sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty, but it can threaten indigenous sovereignty. So there's also impacts or implications where, or unintended consequences where you have legal and economic costs when dealing with government jurisdictions. And it could be challenging for some non-federally recognized tribes due to the limited resources and capacity when dealing with legal issues. And then it compromises indigenous peoples' inherent rights and obligations as First Peoples to steward their original traditional territories and its resources. But all that to say, that's why it's critical that this is indigenous-led. These efforts are always indigenous-led, and that they have a important and consistent say on how that would look. The next slide, please. And I'm going to close off with this because it's important. We are all here looking for solutions and better ways to work together. And the 4 R's are, forming relationship, being proactive about building relationships, and ensuring that all local tribes have a share, tribes that share water or land is necessary for true, full engagement and honest connections. It's about respect, demonstrating regard or consideration for all, flora and fauna and beyond, restoring, and rematriation. Rematriation, meaning the returning of the feminine seeds back into the communities of origin. The indigenous concept refers to reclaiming of ancestral remains, spiritually, culture, science, knowledge, and resources, instead of the more patriarchally associated repatriation. That is one way that we can put our Mother Earth back in balance, help her to become back in balance. And I believe that's the end of the presentation here. I know I skimmed through this quickly, but if there are any questions or comments, please share. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa, for that. There's a question. Are there any current legal efforts in Tovangar regarding rights of nature? There are a couple of things, some in collaboration with or consent of Tongva people and others not so much. The city of Santa Monica adopted a rights to nature ordinance maybe 6 years ago. And as far as I've been able to track, there was no engagement whatsoever with Tongva people, which is a problem. And so thank you for highlighting that question. I think it's important if folks want to pursue rights of nature work, they need to be doing that in collaboration with and under the leadership of local Native nations. And then additionally, Sacred Places Institute in our comments on the LA River Master Plan have actually uplifted recognizing the legal rights of the river as a mechanism for moving forward with the LA River. They didn't take it our consideration. They didn't take it under advisement, but we did make that request. I'm gonna turn it over to Jessa and Gabriella now because we're running short on time. So if you have other questions related to Marisa's talk, please pop them in the chat, and then we will answer those after Gabriella and Jessa wrap up the ally section. Thank you.
Hello again. Let me turn on my camera. So Jessa and I are going to be discussing understanding how to be a good ally. I'm going to be discussing allyship, and Jess is going to be discussing appropriation. So allyship, this little picture here does a really good job of what it summarizes what authentic allyship looks like. So opening space with land acknowledgements in a non-performative way, and understanding that land acknowledgements are just the tip of the iceberg is a form of an authentic allyship, just realizing that you're recognizing whose lands you're on, whose lands your agency is on, and knowing that just a land acknowledgement is not like the end all be all of your interaction with Indigenous people. Creating meaningful relationships with Indigenous people whose homelands you live and work on, And then working with tribal families and communities to understand their viewpoints and needs. So in this little circle, authentic allyship looks like taking risks and holding yourself and other people accountable. Your brand is of no concern. You're educating yourself before you go out to educate others, examining your own privilege and using your privilege to help. You're committed to anti-racist work, not virtue signaling, and taking real action. Making sure that it's not about you. Sitting with discomfort and then holding empathy, grief, and outrage towards things in regards to what you're being allied with is really important. Another thing that's important in terms of allyship is being willing to give up your seat at a table if the Indigenous voices are not present. Time and time again, we have seen panels and speaker series at universities in California, and they don't have Indigenous voices despite them talking about the environment or talking about things that Indigenous people are experts in. And it's really important if you find yourself in one of those positions and you notice that there's no Indigenous person on the panel, looking for that Indigenous person and being like, hey, are you interested in this? Or reaching out to an Indigenous person to find or to help you figure out whose lands you're on and who has the expertise in that area. Giving credit where credit is due. If an idea is utilized from Native folks, they should be involved in how the idea is represented and compensated. And then compensating Indigenous folks for their time, knowledge, and work is really important. I put a quote here from Roland. If you were able to watch our video, he said this about allyship, and I felt it was really impactful. Aside from listening, actually following through with the help that you're offering. Don't be a symbolic ally. Nobody wants that. It's true. It's really easy to be a symbolic ally. It's hard to be an authentic ally. And that's why it's really more impactful when you are an authentic ally.
And what appropriation might look like is wearing headdresses or clothing that some might claim is showing appreciation or respecting our culture, but in fact, it's not. It makes us feel real low. Oftentimes, our youth are known to get to the point of heavy depression and suicidal tendencies over things as simple as that, what some may see as simple. It might also look like stealing ideas and quotes from Indigenous people. A lot of folks, hear things such as water is life and they run with it. And in reality, if you heard something from an Indigenous ally, it's our responsibility to acknowledge that ally in the words that we heard and we liked and we want to share forth. It also looks like excluding Indigenous folks on conversations and actions about their homelands. Again, maybe listening to an Indigenous ally, and really liking what they say and taking that to the table instead of bringing that ally to the table. It also looks like using our ceremonial items, including sage and pipes, out of context. There is a time and a place for these items. And it also looks like having Native folks involved at the slightest capacity just to mark the box for public approval, which has been happening a lot lately. So instead of trying to, check the box to say we did it, see, here they are, try creating relationships with the Indigenous people around you. Best practices and lessons learned on allyship. I'm going to turn it over to some of my colleagues to give examples of positive examples of leadership as well as negative examples of leadership and why these are impactful.
So I can get us started. I think one example for me would be, and this is both a positive and a negative rolled into one. So a lot of the work that Sacred Places Institute does is about making sure that Indigenous voices are centered in conversations around a just transition, because often when people talk about a just transition, they are, they exclude the first people that were forcibly removed from our homelands. And so LA County had formed an ad hoc just transition task force. And one of our allies at East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice noticed that there were no tribal voices as part of that just transition task force. And so they invited Sacred Places Institute to meetings, even though we weren't invited. And so that's the good part of allyship. They saw that our voices weren't there. They demanded that we be included. And when the agency didn't include us, they sent us the information anyway so that we could be there. And so Justin and I attended, and the bad example is the agency in question started with this lovely land acknowledgement about being on the lands of Tongva people, and yet no Tongva people were invited to be on that task force or be a part of the meeting. And so that's an example of negative leadership, because there's an extreme disconnect when you're doing a land acknowledgement, and I would put that in the category of performative, as Jessica just spoke of. You can't do a land acknowledgement and have it mean anything if the very people whose lands you're acknowledging are excluded from the conversation. And why that particular example is impactful is because East Yard created space, absent the administrative go-ahead to do so, for SPI to be there, Justin and I were able to advocate for inclusion of local Native nations. And so ultimately, when that Just Transition Task Force transitioned from being an ad hoc committee to being one that's codified, in that codification, it says that there's a requirement that there be representatives from the Tongva, Saskaviam, and Chumash nations on that Just Transition Task Force. And had it not been for our allies at East Yard, we never would have known about the task force, and we never would have been able to be empowered to advocate on behalf of our community. And so I will turn it over to one of my colleagues.
I can go ahead. I think, well, a positive example of leadership in terms of allyship would be the organization we're working with today, Tree People. They have constantly gone out of their way to include Indigenous voices, and have noticed when other organizations aren't including Indigenous voices, and have put Indigenous people in the spots where they need to be. I think it's really important that we kind of see that and we learn from that, saying like, hey, this is an org that wasn't founded on Indigenous principles, but it has wants the same thing as Indigenous people. So it's just pulling in Indigenous people and working with them has been really important, and it's just been a really positive example of looking out for each other and keeping things uplifting. A negative example of leadership would not to name an org, but it's essentially just a performative allyship example again, where Indigenous people will be brought on the land, brought to a location, and be told all of this information without being told information. They didn't have the chance to share their thoughts or share why that land is sacred to them. They were just told that, oh, we're building a campsite here and you guys can't do anything about it. So it's definitely like, yeah, we have Indigenous voices here, but they're not there in a meaningful way, if that makes sense. And then I will pass it off to Maritza.
Thank you, Gabriela. Yeah, basically, I think that there is an example I can think of off the bat, and this is an organization that resides in one of the most conservative, I believe, places out here in LA. But this organization has been really, I'm not sure if I should name them or not, so I'm not going to name them, but in my observations, I have seen that they go out of their way. They're aware of their white privilege, because we are, in that type of a setting here. So aware of their white privilege, in that they will go out of their way to listen to the needs of tribal folks and to ensure that any vision or needs are met through their advocacy. Understanding that, tribal folks may not have the capacity to do everything as was shared earlier, but they will stick their neck out, and they have proven they have proven that they are allies by doing that. Not by, just saying, come to a meeting, not by saying that they did listen to some folks, but by taking action. And so that's been really wonderful to see. On the other hand, a negative impact would be basically the opposite of what I just explained, which is what you have been hearing. But on the ground level, even within grassroots environmental justice organizations that are, primarily led by neoliberal thinkers, there's a tendency to speak for Indigenous tribes. And that tends to really not sit well at all, as you have been hearing. So that's an example of a negative example of what allies should not look like. And I'll pass it on to Jessa.
Thank you. I think we're pretty much out of time, but I'll be very quick. I'll give a good example is Crystal Cove, who has been working with some of our elders to bring educational components into what they're doing with their youth. They're doing a lot of good work with us. They check in with us often, and they are a prime example of what good allyship is. So recognizing that it is currently 1:57, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Angela.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've got a final 3 minutes. If anybody has any final questions they'd like to share, and or just anything you want to drop in the chat or share a reflection on what you learned today. I do see something from Susanna about the LA County River Plan. There's always going to be a section about tribal consultation pursuant to AB 52 anytime SEEK was triggered. One thing to note about this, and honestly, because the plan is several thousand pages long and the manner in which they responded to comments, I still haven't figured it out. There is a little bit of a quirky thing. At one point, about halfway through COVID pandemic, Governor Newsom did amend temporarily, or he suspended actually the timeline with which tribes were obligated to respond to a request for government-to-government consultation. Sacred Places Institute did raise that in our letter, and I don't know if the county responded. So our point was that it did not appear that their tribal consultation trajectory acknowledged or took into account the fact that due to COVID and its particular impact on tribes, Newsom suspended temporarily the time frame with which tribes had to respond to requests for government-to-government consultation. Any other comments or questions or reflections anyone wants to share? Great, appreciate the feedback. You guys will receive copies of these materials. See if anybody else has any comments. If not, please do, share. You'll receive a survey asking for feedback. We're doing several more of the versions of these talks in the coming months, and so we're grateful for any feedback that you have. And please feel free to reach out. Our contact info is there, so please feel free to reach out if you have any lingering questions. And we look forward to working with you all in the future. And thank you for being here and sharing space with us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Did we stop recording?
Let me do that right now.